Welcome, everybody. Hi, this is the second iteration of the YSI Early Career Days. The YSI Early Career Days are here to serve as an environment for us to better understand the structural barriers that we face as new economic thinkers and figure out how to cope with them. We've realized there's a big demand for this and actually technically very often little support. So that's why it's all the more important for us to work on this together.
Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all. Welcome. Last year, we conducted a YSI Early Career Challenges report that highlights common issues faced by YSI alumni. We're grateful to our YSI Community Board, in particular, Nicolas Aguila, for leading this effort. We see this report, this document, as a living document, which we hope to update with the insights also gained in these YSI Early Career Days. Too often, we assume that problems we encounter are particular to us as individuals, when in fact they are systemic and structural. We hope that YSI, with the help of our mentors, can be the source of mutual support and encouragement. We have no illusions that being and becoming a new economic thinker is difficult, yet this path becomes more bearable and rewarding as we stand together as a community.
This time's program will span 2 days. We're going to start off with our first session with David Colander and Rob Johnson on how to survive as a non-mainstream economist. We're also going to hear today from longstanding YSI member Atanas Pekanov, and we're going to dive into the strategies for building a feminist career in academia at the end of the day. Tomorrow, you can join us for a discussion on the structural issues that face African scholars in particular. And we'll also dive into the mental health issues that are very common to those on the PhD path. So enjoy it. There's plenty of great sessions awaiting.
And in the next weeks and months, we're also organizing, in the spirit of the Early Career Days, many in-depth workshops on teaching, mental health, writing, and other topics that we're raising in these next days. The final session of tomorrow is dedicated to give you a sneak peek and a little bit of a teaser for what these workshops will look like. But you can also go click around the AirMeet. There's a schedule and a sign up there as well. And we're also dropping it here in the chat for you to check out the various workshops that we'll be offering. So we do hope that you can join us for that in the next weeks. So with that, I would really like to welcome to give a word of hello and welcome as well from the YSI Community Board, Danilo Spinola.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Heskey. And thank you for organizing this event, which is something we have been thinking a lot these previous years, given the challenge and the way the community has evolved in this past 10 years in which it existed. And all the early careers that were young scholars since the beginning now are having to face many challenges by themselves. So it's extremely important for us to have these events inside YSI that we can think about solutions and express our concern as a community, as a group. So in the name of the community board, we are all very happy to see how these kinds of events have been going on inside our community, and it's a pleasure to see this evolving in such a nice way that all the strong scholars and young scholars are coming back to give their opinions and perspectives on that. So I give back the word for you, Jay and Heskey. Just want to thank you all for always organizing these kinds of so listening to community and trying to answer the problems and concerns that our community has. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Danilo. It's great that you were able to be here for this kickoff today. I think it's time to really get started now. So for that, I'm excited to welcome on stage research fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, Goncalo Fonseca. Goncalo is going to introduce for us Rob Johnson and David Colander. So please, Goncalo, make sure your audio is on and your camera is on, and then we'll pop out of the way and hand the floor to you.
Hi, thank you very much, Heske, and thank you, Jay and Danilo. So this session, as already announced, features David Colander and Robert Johnson in a discussion on surviving as a mainstream economist. It's my great pleasure to introduce David Colander, a leading voice in economics education and an educator of the profession. He is a college professor at Middlebury College in Vermont. Dave's study with Arjo Clymer on Making of an Economist back in 1990 was one of the most influential studies on graduate economics education. Although I'm not sure he would say all the problems they highlighted have gone away, he's also one of the great all-rounders out there, having contributed to a variety of topics from post-Keynesian macroeconomics, complexity theory, to the history of economic thought and methodology. The author of a great history of economic thought book with Harry Landreth. He's also the author of The Principles of Economics, one, in my opinion, one of the best principles textbooks out there. He continues to be a frequent writer on education and a commentator on the state of the economics profession, and the state of economics itself. We're honored to have him here today. Professor Colander has agreed to talk to us today about a topic that many of you have gathered, which is essentially surviving as a mainstream economist. Joining him will be Robert Johnson, the president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, a survivor himself, and a harbor keeper for other survivors. We hope this will be a great discussion on economics education and the challenges facing young scholars in their early career days. So let me welcome Robert Johnson.
Who are on the road must have a code that you can live by, and so become yourself, because the past is just a goodbye. Teach the children well.
Good day, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I think often about the challenge in any walk of life of addressing differences with another person with a constructive state of mind, with a constructive spirit. And when I think of examples from my own life, I don't often think of anyone who does a better job of that than Professor David Colander. I've been with him in a ZZ with teaching groups around the agendas of Scholas Occurrentes and Pope Francis at the leadership. I've read many of his essays. My undergraduate advisor at MIT was Robert Solow. I read an old essay of his called Being an Economic Gadfly, Confessions of an Economic Gadfly. And I watched him take on MIT and the University of Chicago. But here, in addition, the energy that comes from, how would I say, taking people on is creating a light at the end of the tunnel and taking a spirit that has what you might call the camaraderie of working together in that process. And David is an extraordinary example as a researcher, as Goncalo pointed out, as a gentleman who engages in dispute in a way where people are taught to learn. When I was a young boy, my father was a professor of medicine at the University of Michigan, and he left that to become a physician, a clinical urologist in downtown Detroit for the underserved. And when I became a PhD, my father said to me, he understood my temperament because we'd wrestled a little bit when I was a teenager, but he often said, look, you're going to get into disputes. If you let people think you're a dragon, you're a dragon. When you differ with them, look them in the eye and listen. And then they'll know you're not a dragon, you're a human, and you'll make much greater progress. I have not seen a scholar in economics, which is a very contentious environment, where someone has demonstrated my father's guidance better than Professor Dave Colander. Dave, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to learning from you and sharing thoughts with you over this next hour.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate that. I'm not sure this is going to be all that great a talk. The reason is I'm much better over scotch, sitting around afterwards, looking at what happened and trying to figure out why did the interaction go the way it did. So I tend to sort of be a person who watches myself, watching myself, and carrying it up to various levels. And sort of that leaves me sort of without being clear what position I have, but trying to understand the process overall. And really sort of that led to this talk. So when they asked me would I come and say something here, I thought back to, I think it's 20, 30 years ago when I wrote a paper called Surviving as a Non-Mainstream Economist. I think then I called it Surviving as a Heterodox Economist, but I want to argue against that now. And so I thought here, trying to update it. And then I tried updating it over Zoom. It's much harder because we can't be sitting around that. But I'll try and do the best I can. And sort of there saying, this was advice that I was sitting around, sort of trying to give people, young students coming into economics, how to do it. Because I want to see them succeed. And the question was, here, there was an approach in economics in the 60s and 70s, goes all the way back then, that had an active heterodox group. But there was a difference between the heterodox group then and now, because in the 60s and 70s, heterodox sort of was based around sort of major schools. There were groups of people at the major schools. As it evolved, the major schools sort of closed off and became very insulated. And sort of heterodox groups moved to the outside. And sort of that sort of worried me because that took out the conversation that I think was needed between the heterodox and the mainstream, and sort of created a tension that I thought was inappropriate. So that's really the big issue of what I hope to sort of bring out here, is get you thinking about, sort of here, what is a mainstream economist? And that all of you are mainstream economists. That mainstream economics, the way I interpret it, is broad tent, includes lots of different views. Why do I include that? Because we can go back and look at the history of economic thought, and pretty much anything that anybody's saying now was brought up earlier by some other economist, and often a top economist. It gets pushed out along the side, but not because the idea is bad necessarily, but because of the way institutions work. And really sort of that's sort of the structure of the emphasis that I'm giving, is that you have to understand the way institutions are working. And if you're going to survive, you have to operate within those institutions. You can't be complaining about them because it doesn't do any good, not because it's inappropriate. So I take the position that a good mainstream economics includes almost all heterodox ideas. So calling one heterodox is not a good way to advance your career or to advance your ideas. So if you're talking to a reporter and you tell them, here's a heterodox idea, sort of the nature says, well, I have to sort of write this on a side issue. If you tell him here, this is a central important idea, which it is, then he'll be thinking along those lines. So to self-identify as a heterodox economist, I feel does not help sort of the economists that are there. So what I thought I'd do, I recently wrote a book review, sort of there, and it was on sort of an edited volume of economics. And there was a book review of being done by heterodox economics who said they were looking at sort of the history of economic thought. But very quickly it got into sort of attacks on here's what's wrong with economics currently. And as if sort of the people who are reading it and thinking about it don't know what's wrong with economics. Good mainstream economists know there's lots and lots of problems with economics, with the ideas there. They use them as fables. Here, this might be useful for thinking about things, not as being the truth. So if you accept most of the models that are being done are done for a reason, sort of they're operating within their own history, and sort of take them as just fables, then you can start discussing the real issues. And sort of that's how you move and start discussing the real issues that I think is important. So some advice that I had was that here, if you're doing it, you don't think you're going to change the profession. First, there's a problem that the profession is what I call enormously sort of internalized, and sort of operates as intellectual incest, I'd probably call it. That if you don't go to sort of a central set of 10, maybe 15 schools and are part of that cabal, sort of what you believe doesn't matter, sort of the process that goes there. Within the profession itself, the way it operates, there's probably 25 to 50 people coming into economics who are seen as sort of who could have major changes in economics. The institutions is built to emphasize the issues they look at, not the issues other people look at. If you take them as sort of here encouragement, sort of what happens is here, if it hasn't been said here at MIT or something, then it hasn't been said. And that protects that's not done to keep out ideas though. It's done simply because that's the way the process works. People in power tend to develop institutions that protect that power. And so one has to understand that and say, how can I sort of get people to, one, recognize that what they're doing is protecting power, and number two, start to think of things outside of their sort of way of looking at it. So that's what one has to do, I think, for overall long run, what economics should be. Because I think what economics is quite different from what I think most of you think it should be, and what most people think it should be. It should be looking at very important issues as opposed to small issues. It should be open to lots of different ideas. It should be pluralist. But pluralist not in the sense of this science is wrong, these models are wrong. Pluralist in the sense of, yes, give me an idea. Do I see that it makes some sense? And I'll debate it with you. So I've always taken the approach here, I'm assuming people are intelligent and will write sort of there, trying to sort of be what I'd consider an open mainstream economist would consider. That's the person I'm trying to converse with, not other or heterodox economists. The problem is other heterodox economists, it's too easy to agree. So you're in a separate sort of garden that protects ideas, heterodox ideas, as much as it does outside of that. And the real issue is sort of something that John Stuart Mill emphasized. You've got to design a structure that brings the different ideas together and has them attacking it. Not as being here, I'm attacking to beat you, but attacking to better understand, to sort of have knowledge. So you're searching for it, you're debating, you're arguing, not to win the argument, but to further understanding. That's the sort of philosophical approach to advancing thought that seems to have been lost from economics. And it's sort of what I've been trying to push we need a lot more of. And that leads me to sort of do things like calling MIT and Harvard as having an ancestral relationship. And that sort of here, probably 60% of the people teaching at Harvard and MIT have a Harvard and MIT background. If you include undergraduates, probably 75% have that. And then, of course, you have the clones of that. So that sort of defines, here is where ideas get in. That should be pointed out continually so that people sort of recognize here what filters through the institutional structure of economics is not necessarily, what's best. Now, what I did then is say, okay, should you be trying to change all that? And the answer I gave to young economists is no. Yes, in the long run you should, but in the short run, what you should be doing is figuring out, here's the institutional structure of where I can get a job, of what I can be doing, and here's how that institutional structure works. and what I might be able to do to sort of succeed within that. Because if you're not succeeding within the institutional structure that you're living in, you'll be pushed out and will no longer be an economist. And there's enormous push, especially in Europe, away from doing what I consider a broader base, it was a quite different sense, to something that's very limited as to here's what you have to do. So I encourage people to very much take that into account and figure out how can I succeed within that institutional structure while pointing out the differences. So there's two different research strategies. One is thinking long-term, here's the changes I'll make, and to support that. The other is thinking short-term, and how do I sort of advance and sort of stay within the acceptable allowance of the profession. And sort of there I get, you don't talk about methodology. You don't write about methodology because that's something we all consider very important. The thing is, there isn't much demand for discussions of methodology. And so therefore, it's going to be really hard to advance within the existing institutions. And I give a type of examples that I think would be teaching relevant research, that here by focusing on teaching, one does something that everyone knows is important, but that the mainstream gives very little credence to, very little focus on. So it's a niche that's sort of left open for heterodox economists to look at. And I think sort of the emphasis on that, here's what we're teaching and what society pays us to do is really teaching. And yet sort of the profession channels money given to it to teach into sort of doing research that it defines however it defines. And sort of pointing that out, sort of again and again, I think is useful. So my concluding advice was really decide what good economics is and have that as your ultimate goal, but always work within sort of the existing institutional structure, being aware of it, to see that you're advancing and moving on as an economist. Because if you don't survive, you don't sort of get your bigger arguments made. So, sort of after you become successful, and I think Rob has done this very well, worry about sort of how can I help other people? I think what you'll find is that those people who have been successful are very open to trying to help younger scholars operate within there. I know for me, it was very lucky. So I, so went off and sort of wrote a paper that got totally rejected at the AEA. I probably would have been finished as an economist, but Abba Lerner sort of picked me up and said, I kind of like your ideas, and did a couple papers with me. And suddenly, he might have something to say. So I was allowed to say things that I wouldn't otherwise do. Recognize that that type of thing goes on all the time and take advantage of it. Sort of is something that I think is very important. But give encouragement to people who are doing it, make it realistically encouraging, which means here, don't talk to other heterodox economists. Don't write for them. Write for what I call enlightened mainstream. And there's a large number of people out there, and encourage that here, when you talk about economics, what it is the enlightened mainstream, which accepts lots of models that they know don't apply, that they know miss lots of elements, and deal with those other elements in different ways, and be arguing, here's different ways in which you can deal with it. So at that, I think I'll stop and leave it to Rob to sort of question me. Well,
thank you, David. I think there's so many dimensions of this. I wanted to start with something you wrote right at the beginning of the article, surviving as a non-mainstream economist. Said, one of the ways in which I differ from most mainstream economists is the way I believe institutions should be integrated into economic thinking. I see as institutions as central to our understanding of the economy. One cannot understand the economy unless one understands the way institutions work. I'm thinking of that both outwardly, but also in the context of the economics profession as itself an institution. And you're giving us a guide as to how to navigate those rapids, meaning peer-reviewed journals, being respectful of elders and their creativity, being constructive and not toxic and so forth. But it's often been said to me, as I run INET, I hear all sorts of criticism, that the economics profession models people as though they're driven by financial and economic incentives, but they adopt perhaps an unmindful perspective on themselves, is that they provide for the global public good, and they're not affected by the same incentives that they say all other human beings are immersed in the, what you might call, magnetic field of. So I'm just curious how you see the role of advancement, peer-reviewed journals, consulting opportunities, government appointments as what we might call the siren songs of temptation that are understandable. I'm not diminishing them, but they do play a role in what people choose to do and not to do. And my board member who writes for the Financial Times, Gillian Tett, once said to me, "Rob, I'm a PhD in anthropology. If you want INET to make progress, study the silences, because what is in what is not said is the roadmap to where power exists and where progress needs to be made."
I fully agree and fundamentally agree that here individuals are worried about something much more than sort of financial gain, material gain. Classical economists thought we'd have solved the economic problem. And I've structured a couple papers sort of arguing we have solved the economic problem as they saw it, which was here we had needs. What we have now are not sort of needs in terms of material needs. What we have are wants and desires that are created by the system itself. So the system sort of operates, creating those. And one of those is sort of to be seen as positive by your fellow men and women. That really is sort of the institutional structure that guides it. And what I argued, so when I looked at sort of here intellectual incest, it was here that they were keeping those ideas there and attacking it. So I think, sort of it's very important to see it like that and to let the, sort of profession sort of see it like that. But it doesn't change my overall sort of structure that what I think we should be doing is understanding that. And so when we started looking at the economics profession, sort of it was really because I wanted to understand why certain simple ideas that I was discussing that I could discuss with other top economists, sort of a lot of economists wouldn't even consider, trying to understand sort of why it became so insular. And that was really because here they had developed a sort of method to sort of protect sort of the institutional structure that was there. And sort of a lot of that means here the models we're using, which assumes that those issues away, are not sufficient to talk about policy. But I distinguish policy discussion very much from the science of economics. The science of economics has nothing to say about policy because policy involves much more than just science. It uses science, but in addition, it uses sort of values, discussion of that, a knowledge of the institutional structure, and areas that science hasn't had a chance to consider yet because it's just too complex. And that sort of got my interest into complexity economics because what it says is science sort of understands only a small part of the reality that's there. And somehow we have to integrate that. Thinking that, what does that mean for institutions, I think is important. Anthropologists, in many ways, are the ones who should be teaching principles of economics. So one of the ideas I've been sort of throwing around is we need other people than economists to be teaching principles. The profession doesn't really care about what, it just pushes it aside, tries to create people. Here are the people who will teach it. They aren't really full economists. They're sort of teachers of economics, and they create two tracks. I think we should fight totally against that that teaching of economics is what economics is paid for and really should be a central issue. But the economists who are trained aren't trained to be teachers of principles of economics. So they shouldn't be allowed to teach it. It isn't that here they don't want to teach it. They shouldn't be allowed because they don't have the background, the discussion, or sort of the interest and knowledge of that to really do a good job. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that would be, the way I'd structure it.
One of the things that I've read that you've written and heard you say in person in the past relates to history of economic thought as a dimension of what I'll call curriculum. I remember John Kenneth Galbraith wrote a book, I think it was called The History of Economic Ideas, Past as Present, where he said the creation of ideas, if you really look at this in a historical context, is not what I'll call disembodied logical kind of aha. It's inspired by the context in which we live, which resonates with where I went back to my first comment, understanding the institutions and understanding the challenges in society is what inspires what you might call meaningful innovation in terms of its guidance for the public. But in the training, when I was a graduate, I was going to another place. Charles Kindleberger inspired me to become an economist. Secondly, I got to see Paul Samuelson's graduate course in the history of economic thought when I went to graduate school in Princeton. Will Baumol taught history of thought, Lester Chandler and Claudia Golden taught economic history, and they were requirements of graduate students. Are we not making a mistake if all we focus on is technique, whether it be math or statistical, when the richness and the understanding of the dynamic of how ideas evolved could inform us on our journey as contributors to the world of ideas?
The answer is absolutely. I totally agree with that. The problem is we've now sort of defined and created a profession that really doesn't have any of that background. So it isn't here, sort of that should we be using it? I wouldn't want the people who are sort of teaching history of thought, because their interest isn't that. Their interest is very specific, in solving certain problems. So we can take Raj Chetty as an example. Sort of here doing wonderful work. It's very important. It creates a big class, the largest class in economics at Harvard, sort of operating there. But, sort of what it is a big data issue. Sort of it doesn't talk about sort of should we have this policy or that policy. It says here, if you've decided you're going to sort of look at sort of a set of policies and you have a $10 million research budget, here's how you can decide this particular question. That's a very useful skill, but it isn't a broad skill that would be trying to decide here, sort of, are we, sort of trying to sort of do it best by having this progressive tax or not? That raises all kinds of other issues that aren't even touched within the science. So I think there's many different ways economics could be taught. But pretty much sort of the path I think both of us would like is now dead. Won't be done within the institutional structure that we have because of the way the profession has evolved. So what it should do, in my view, is concentrate on the science, big data, sort of operating there, and let people sort of do the things that are there and say, here, just recognize it doesn't answer all these other questions, and that should be a very important part of economics too. So it isn't saying here what we should do, it's saying here is some other things. And the best way to do that, and that's why the one institutional change I've been pushing, would be to do away with social science departments and sort of put in one big social science, put it all together, sociology, anthropology, psychology, history, economics, all one, let them fight it out, because that's the fight we should be having, and it's not the fight we are having.
Yes. When I began looking for a pathway for INET, I spoke to many of the people I thought were the creative leaders, including Ken Arrow, George Akerlof, and others. And they pointed me towards two programs One was the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research Program, and another was the MacArthur Foundation. And both were putting excellent scholars from multiple disciplines together. And when they shared with me the minutes of some of their meetings, and I interviewed some of the people then, they said, for the economists, it was wonderful to be in sessions with people who didn't have, which you might call, the same unconscious assumptions of the way to go about things. So they learned from people that they learned to respect through their interaction, and they became multidisciplinary. I mentioned Kindleberger. He said to me when I first looked at becoming an economist, and I was an engineer, mathematics wasn't overwhelmingly difficult for me. And he said, Rob, history is what makes you multidisciplinary. You've got to reach in a number of directions to synthesize and recognize the patterns that's going on in history. That's why it's important training for economists.
Yes, I think, the thing is, we agree too much, Rob. I think, so fully in agreement there. But again, I think the economics profession has so evolved that creating a multidisciplinary one is not possible unless you actually get changes within that. Because you're starting to look, should I write a multidisciplinary paper? Where would I publish it? Will it be seen within that? As long as the institutions, the academic institutions, are separate. And so economists judge economists' output. Sociologists judge sociologists' output. Then you won't get what I consider true transdisciplinary discussions, because you don't have anybody looking at that, or there's no payoff. And you don't make it through that process. And so I think unless there's institutional change at the university level, which really changes and says, here, as peer reviewers, they should not be only peer reviewers in the field. There should be peer reviewers outside the field. So I argued to NSF on some hearings that what they should do is have physicists, so sociologists, sort of there on the peer review system, looking at it. And they could look and say, does this make sense? And a lot of economic proposals, I said, would not make much sense to a lot of people. And if they couldn't make it make sense, and it wasn't whether it was technical or not, I was happy to have physicists on it, or chemists or anything else. It was just using common sense. Mm-hmm. And that sort of is gone from the institutional structure. So how do you point that out and force it is sort of why I try and sort of make noise at times. Sort of pick something. Here is something that reporters can catch on. So thinking of that from a reporter's point of view, this is the way other people see from outside economics, how they see economics. That here being very useful for them. The problem for me was 30, 40 years ago, I had an in with lots of reporters. I mean, I was always asking to be on background. So I didn't start getting involved. But for me, it was very important. Those reporters have all retired now. And there's a new set where I no longer have sort of the input that I had before. But I think it's through that, not here what shows up, but the informal networks of discussion. Here, because I said I don't want to be quoted or anything else, they felt they could call me up just for background. Does this make sense or not? And that sort of, people need that. And we need institutions that arrive at that. So, sort of that's what I think is there. And one has to emphasize it. So why don't I bring up one difference I've had with INET?
Please.
Sort of over time, because that would probably be useful. So, INET is absolutely wonderful. So it has offered lots of changes. I've been involved with INET, very much from the beginning, sort of just on the outside and everything else. But I've always said here, you've got to work much harder than what you're working on to see yourself as being unbiased, not being seen as sort of a, liberal, sort of progressive, sort of think tank, but sort of to bring in alternative views. And that's sort of the saving grace, because what the mainstream does, if there's any bias whatsoever or possibility of a bias, they dump on it and say, oh, it's just political bias. And that isn't what's driving INET. Mm-hmm. but it's what people can say drives INET. And so therefore one has to work very, very hard. So with the, textbook that was there, I wanted to make sure one had sort of a group of people who were seen as coming from the other philosophical position. Sort of there. And I didn't think INET worked hard enough to maintain that. I mean, it's hard to do because here there's a not normal process of here we're talking. But I've been working on now sort of what I call the Delphi method. I don't know if you know, which says here when you're doing forecasts, you need people who disagree totally with that to sort of be part of the process of doing it. It can't be afterwards. It's not peer review. It's before, because it's built into the very structure of the way things are done. And unless we include institutions that get that multi-world view from the beginning, you're finished.
Well, I think that's a healthy criticism. I'll quote one of my advisors in the Academic Council, Roman Friedman, who's a professor at New York University.
He went to school with me.
It is interesting. In the realm of Ned Phelps, I believe.
Yes.
And Roman said to me, the job of INET is to foment critical discourse. Everyone can be on the stage, but don't line up a whole bunch of people that already agree, or we won't learn anything. There won't be any sparks and there won't be any light. I think that what you say is very powerful. Let me ask you another question, because it was etched into my mind when we were together in Azizi with the Scholas group, and they were talking about the need to listen to young people, because many people on earth don't go to college. And so if they drop out of high school, their education is what you might call interrupted by the yearnings, particularly in poorer families, to earn money. But if you can engage them with relevant material, they'll stay and they'll progress further, and society will be healthier. And in that exploration, that day when that theme was at the center, you said something about, well, you can't just essentially have everything come in, because you got to learn how to distance from the turmoil in society and go to a place of reflection and become discriminating about that which you believe and what you learn and what you espouse. And so I guess what I'm saying there is sometimes the profession can look dogmatic with what it filters out, but other times people say the pendulum may rock too far in the other direction, where raging emotion is not necessarily an input to wise results, and that there is a role for academic reflection, for being in the tower and contemplation, for synthesizing this balance. And I thought when you said that, it was magnificent, but I just wanted to enlarge that thought for the audience today.
I think, again, it sort of goes back to the way I'm always looking at sort of reality, but looking at sort of people looking at reality and looking there. It's turtles all the way down. Sort of that essentially is, what one's talking about. That is, sort of here, there's a need to the limit, but at the same time, there's a need not to. And you've got to be open to both simultaneously and trying to figure out and not protect and sort of say, we won't discuss it. We will discuss it, but here, this is the discussion that's happened before. And this is where I've sort of gone against a lot of heterodox economists, because as stuff I read, that discussion has gone on before. I know it. I've seen it, sort of here again and again. Top economists wouldn't disagree with you. They just say, here, what do you have to offer? And sort of here, I think one has to say, here, it's not, can I convince my friends that these are important? It's very easy to say economics is really, really stupid, because it is in many ways. All of reality is really, really stupid. The question is sort of what is sort of sufficiently makes sense to sort of allow it to continue without trying to fight it. And that's a much, much more nuanced and difficult discussion. But those are the discussions we should have, and are discussions that sort of young scholars often haven't the background to discuss it. So there's a reason why, so we don't turn it over to the youth. We need it at times because the old fogies can get old fogies and just sort of continue to say, oh, yes, this is the way we've done it. But at the same time, sort of the old fogies were the young people before, sort of recognized it and have embodied certain understandings that one should be aware of and constantly trying to fit together. And so I'm not saying there's an answer, but there is a process. And it really goes back to John Stuart Mill and sort of his particular approach. And I think sort of by emphasizing Mill's approach, which is really sort of a different type of argumentation, where the argumentation is part of the way our understanding comes about. We're not solving a model. We're providing consensus. So the role of an economist in policy is to suggest consensus policies that people with very differing views can come to an agreement on. That's a quite different view of what policy is than here we're trying to optimize some social welfare function, which we can't specify, but here we can be very careful and list all the things.
I hear an echo. I was in a meeting at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington a week ago when someone mentioned that John Kay and Mervyn King have written a book on the theme of radical uncertainty. And the synopsis that was presented was what these two authors, who I've made a podcast with and know quite well, were presenting was it's ridiculous to make people study models as opposed to study the financial markets and derive models from studying the underlying behavior and things that you see. Now, I can see it going in both directions because sometimes a model, it isn't, we might call a one-for-one map, but sometimes by focusing on key drivers, it illuminates the essence of the process. The simplification allows you to see through all the clutter. But sometimes if you're only studying models and you're not feeling the discord between inductive observation and the model, which doesn't explain some of the things you perceive, you're not in appropriate tension to be creative.
Yeah. I do think there's some big changes going on within sort of the way data is analyzed. So if I look at the history of econometrics, econometrics was earlier part of statistics. It was seen as the same part, and sort of it specialized and took one particular approach. Here, what econometrics was testing of theory. So you needed the theory first and then the testing of the theory. And that's what economists did in there. In doing that, econometrics split from statistics because statistics wasn't training people to do models. It was training people to be actuaries. And actuaries had to say, here is what is actually at risk and here's what price you should put on something. Those did not follow from models. Models were used, but here in statistics were used, but you didn't take them too seriously. Because here you knew there were all kinds of other things you were trying to integrate in. So that's where econometrics moved away totally from statistics, which very much became training grounds for actuaries. Now what's happened with big data is sort of the testing of theory. Theory, just isn't important. The data overwhelms it. So you have data first. Is bringing back, so artificial intelligence is bringing economics back to a different way of doing econometrics, of thinking about what you're doing. And I think that's a major change, which is now occurring, and that sort of the non-mainstream economists could get around. We believe in artificial intelligence because what it isn't testing theory. It's directly applying and looking for patterns in the data and figuring out how we can integrate those together. And that's a major change which is occurring, which I think leaves an opening for non-mainstream economists to say, here, the basic thinking within econometrics was wrong because it doesn't sort of deal with data in a way that's reasonable, given sort of the data points that we have?
I think there are two dimensions that approach the, the front porch of INET that I'm exposed to very often. One is that energy that you mentioned of Raj Chetty. By illuminating the sense of proportion, you start to learn more about which problems are important or not. And he's very modest about offering interpretations from his data, which I think helps foment a broader discussion rather than declaring what the truth is. The second realm, and it kind of grew out of critique of the rational expectations hypothesis, is this notion of radical uncertainty. Sometimes you can see what the data says, but you know that the structure is not what's called ergodically stable. And so you're not talking about something that can estimate the parameters of a model that's good for the next period or the period after that, because the future is unknown and unknowable, and there is a constant evolution like that. That's part of what Roman Friedman's work is about. And then finally, one of the things that I'm finding people just bombarding me with now, and it's probably not surprising as the pandemic and other dimensions are rising, is the notion that you can study the economy without understanding the system of politics, because it's setting the boundaries, the constraints, the shadow prices, and around which we operate. And it's viewed in a fantasy world like it comes from the sovereignty of people, when we all see that politicians are affected by lobbyists, need campaign contributions. So what you might call organic political economy. If we were looking at the institutions, I don't think we would separate those quite as powerfully as the economics profession has in recent years.
Agreed, 100%.
What, you kind of, how would I say, my culminating question for the last 7 or 8 minutes, you kind of got to it before I asked it. What I was going to say is, if you were the chairman of INET, we're starting our 14th year, what would you advise us to do in the next 5 to 10 years to make the most difference, given your perspective and your insights?
Worry about institutional changes within the advancement of economists. So very much here, how sort of students coming in, they're interested in lots of different issues. The question is very quickly, if you're going to succeed, you have to operate within the institutions that are there. So I think unless policy involves institutional change, as opposed to sort of here a policy itself. So I would sort of emphasize much more how to convince everybody that INET is, sort of totally unbiased as much as it possibly can. It's not totally, because to be totally unbiased says I'm biased. Here are my views. But I have other sort of ways of offsetting that. And so I sort of argued here, sort of what should happen with the text. And this is where I sort of moved away from INET, was that here you needed a right-wing group, the Koch brothers possibly, to sort of do it with INET. So here it was seen as the two sides being the ones who are challenging it. They're challenging the middle. And sort of I think one could have developed that and sort of then had a much stronger argument for it, where it wouldn't be seen as, it's trying to sort of slide in progressive values or progressive positions on that.
Yeah.
Because it would be. So that would be, one. The other one would be within sort of the advancement, sort of changing the nature of peer review. Sort of there. When you look at papers, you pass them on to other people. So say, sort of you're working on a paper. You've shown it to 7 or 8 people. It goes through peer reviews automatically there, of the ones who are similar to people. And the problem is most stuff goes by peer review to people who are similar to what one has, sort of exists now. And so it isn't peer review. It's sort of here, yes, they meet within the peer structure. But the point is, sort of, it isn't whether it meets the peer structure. Does it say something interesting and really challenge it? And does it do it in a way that's acceptable to a group that is not yet defined, but which one can tell here are people who are knowledgeable in their field, but also very open. So those would be sort of the two issues that I'd look at.
You know, I think you're right that we have underemphasized not only the potential to work with people. You mentioned the Koch brothers, but scholars at George Washington University. We had a very positive and vital experience with Bruce Caldwell, who was the curator of the Hayek papers, and Hayek and Keynes were kind of brought in as dance partners in the history of thought earlier on. But I do think I take what you say very seriously, and I think it's very important not to look like you're what you might call a predetermined ideological weapon, but you are engaged in the exploration for the good of all.
It's the perception of that's really important. So it goes beyond sort of, can you do it? And Mill has this wonderful discussion of here, the devil's advocate is no longer enough. You have to sort of have somebody who fundamentally believes that other point of view and is willing to argue it. So Bruce would be sort of a reasonable person. You need a couple unreasonable people out there simultaneously. Maybe sort of an anti-Roman or something, sort of might be good.
Yeah. A Greek instead of a Roman. Teasing you. But well, I think this. How do I say? You underscore that though I was the guy they called the moderator today, or in conversation with you, I feel very fortunate. I feel like I was a student at your school today, and I've always followed your light, and I've always read that wonderful constellation of papers on the Middlebury website under your name that links and brings us forward and alerts us to books and what have you. And how do I say? I look forward to continuing to learn from you. But I've learned in this last hour, like our whole audience has, and probably the best thing I can do now is step aside and let Goncalo bring forward a whole constellation of questions that the audience has created in light of how you have stimulated them today.
Sounds good.
But thank you, David. I mean, I'll be here right through the end, but really thank you for not only being here today, but for the whole thing you've been in your career as an example to me and to these young people who are in our audience.
Thank you very much, Professor Colander and Rob. This has been an amazing discussion, and sobering as well. There's several questions that are coming up, and of course, you can probably anticipate what they can be. One of the questions is, if we are to work within the institutional framework that's there, while not forgetting about what's important to ourselves, how can we tell we've got the balance right? How do we know we're not doing too much of one thing or the other?
If you lose your job, you don't have your balance right. So if you lose your job, you don't. So you push it and you'll never know whether you have it. It's sort of like riding a bike. You feel it and sort of do the best you can. And maybe you'll be wrong. But, sort of, I think, sort of it's a feel that you have for it. Here, there's, sort of enough there. And it depends on your position in life. So in other words, when you're first coming out, you can do anything you want because you don't have a family. You start getting a family and you start having kids, quite honestly, your perspective changes. Sort of what you need in terms of sort of safety, changes. And that has to be taken into account. So recognize you're going to go through different stages of life and try and figure out, how am I balancing all of these? There's no answer other than sort of to be reflective and sort of always to consider that.
You talked about multidisciplinarity in the social sciences. Do you see us moving in that direction? Or does it remain sort of a pipe dream that institutions won't be ready in a million years? And what could change that?
Pipe dream, institutions won't be ready in a million years. Sort of institutions, academic institutions are the firmest, institutions built in so heavily with that and so little rational thought about why they exist that I see very little chance of changing them. So, first, it isn't multidisciplinary, it's transdisciplinary. where here people think of themselves as sort of doing all of it simultaneously, which means the training of each different field would have to fundamentally change. And we sort of created sort of a complexity sort of graduate program that we suggested as some of the work we were doing sort of there. And sort of here's the courses we suggest you take within sort of a broad social science, complexity social science. It was not picked up by anybody, nor did we expect it. And so the answer is, so it was a pipe dream to talk about, but which sort of, you don't look about bringing that about, but bringing about small changes. So one of the things is sort of here, the type of research one does. I argued that here, individuals, sort of at sort of non-top schools should have an option, or at every school should have an option of doing teaching relevant research, which is a fundamentally different type of research that's going on. It's oftentimes working with a particular group on a very small problem, sort of within sort of how you can resolve that. And so you give out research chits to society. So here I'm thinking of a university that's there. Here, individuals who have problems, sort of businesses that have problems, can go to academics and give them these chits. That pays the academic salary, and the academic advises them. So you're integrating academics within sort of the actual dealing of the real world. And sort of that's how you view people's research. Unless you can get those type institutional changes, you won't bring about any other change. What I think will change is sort of technology is going to change the nature of universities fundamentally in ways that here we will have digital universities much more so. It'll be done with a variety of different ways of which, this type of things goes on. And sort of it's the how you evaluate that is there. And that'll bring about the change.
In the making of Economists, that the study you did a while back, what faults do you identify then? What do you think has changed since, and what hasn't? Or what new problems have emerged, and do you have confidence that they'll be addressed?
Okay, I've really done two studies on making of an economist, 10 years apart. So let me talk about the change that happened there. When we first did it, we were attacking theory. Sort of theory was everything at the time in the 70s. And sort of that's the way it was. So here, and you added a little data at the end of the paper to say, oh yes, here's a little data, but it was theory and carrying it. We said that was kind of crazy. By the second time, when I did Making of an Economist Redux, which was probably 10, 12 years after, theory had gone way, way down in estimation. It had been replaced by empirical work. So empirical work done. So the nature of an article now was you do empirical work, and then you add a little bit of theory afterwards. So that had fundamentally changed. It sort of emphasized empirical work much more so than it did. And it came from an econometrics background that sort of still hadn't moved to artificial intelligence. I think what's changing now is sort of here, they're moving to what I consider a better system. Sort of a combination of those, which is artificial intelligence, although I don't call it artificial intelligence. It is simply pattern finding and abstract pattern finding within sort of there. That's developing into sort of a new field and sort of will be the driving force of what's there. So I think there's been improvements. So if you look, we picked on theory, and theorists couldn't get a job in the 80s. Not today. Economic theorists are in enormous demand because it's their work that underlies the search algorithms for many of the systems. So any good internet company has economists on their staff, a whole group of economists working on it and integrating because they're working with it. Sort of the stuff they're doing is really exciting and interesting. And so theory moved ahead. And I think the same thing is happening with empirical work. So I'm actually quite positive about economics. I did a piece, for the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2000 on economics in 50 years. Sort of what was it going to be like? And sort of I started from a book paper Solow had done, where he said economics was the uneducated trying to solve the unknowable. and said here it would change, where it's the appropriately educated finding the knowable what is and sort of recognizing that. And I think, so that's a move to what I call stopping to consider science as separate and considering it social science as complexity science. And here we start with sort of considering complex systems, and then we start saying, how do we deal with it? So that I see as major improvements for that, although, sort of it's not mentioned or discussed.
Well, that sort of brings up the next question of how you define complexity economics, and do you believe it can really open the field of economics into a relevant science in the 21st century?
Well, again, so yes, I believe, how do I define complexity economics? Pattern finding. It's sort of a recognized here, sort of you're trying to find and understand patterns and use patterns to try and shape and influence the system you're looking at. So it takes a different approach. It's a pure mathematical approach. You can have there where you're really looking at it, but
Looks like we briefly lost Professor Colander. We're back.
still connected.
He's back.
Okay, that sort of mathematics sort of is very useful for that in thinking about the broad conceptions. What it does is then drive you to institutional analysis, because the institutions are such level of fine granularity that you can't sort of use grand models to deal with it. You need sensibility, sort of historical understanding, and sort of drives you to a different way. And they integrate the two together. So those who see artificial intelligence as eliminating the need for sort of human sort of activity, I think is wrong. It's there, and sort of human activity is integrated fully into it. And we're trying to understand, but there's always changes that are occurring that you're trying to integrate. That still hasn't happened yet. And I don't see it as happening because here, the way in which sort of people advance, they apply in economics. Until you say here, these, in undergraduate schools could do it, saying we don't want individuals trained in particular specialties. We want people trained in these broad areas who can teach 4 or 5 different fields. So we have physicists teaching introductory economics. And because, they'd be integrated into that. So it's a whole different way of thinking about sort of who we want as teachers. And I argue the way we got into the position we have is we have the wrong group of people sort of teaching, because we take research first and teaching second. What I think we should have is teaching first and research second.
Well, that drives exactly into sort of my next question. You talk about the need for generalists and that we need other people other than economists. But it's not only the institutions that drive them out, it's also the teaching itself drives them out. In a sense that the curious or the people who might have a broader vision are driven away from the profession or turned off by economics. And those that remain have that interest sort of beaten out of them. Is there a way to break this chain? Many of our young people here are moving on to academic careers and have a sort of responsibility for teaching the next generation. How do we not repeat the same mistakes of our teachers?
We repeat it because I can't figure out any way to change it. The way I push for one reform, I push for lots of different reforms, almost none of which get sort of passed or anything else, was to create a PhD in liberal arts. And so in the US, sort of liberal arts are very important, sort of an undergraduate programs see themselves as teaching liberal arts. Well, liberal arts, I argued, was complexity. And sort of you should, by getting majors in 3 or 4 different subjects, which sort of don't overlap. So you do one in physics, say one in economics, and one in history or sociology. You get those 4, that's your PhD. Now you can teach any of the principles courses in any of those fields. And that should be half the professor teaching undergraduates should be individuals trained in that way. that should be the driving force of what's there, because they're the broad individuals who are looking for those issues. It didn't succeed at my school or any other that I know.
Thank you so very much. Is there a way to do this in our own teaching, even if it's not a gigantic institutional transformation, but adaptations we can make? You wrote a textbook, Principles of Economics, which inserted a lot of different sort of views and tried to sort of change the way economics was taught. Do you believe there's still a chance for that, or is it going to be narrowing? Or
again, there's always a chance for it, but the reality is sort of the technology is pushing in the opposite direction. So pretty much it's going to here, what one's going to have are very large classes, which means here we want online learning systems. So I used to be a textbook author, sort of, which means here I wrote, but an author meant here it had a book with a sort of idea and an approach that differs from others. My publisher did not want that, does not want that, because what they want to do is sell themselves as an online sort of learning system provider. And so I'm a content provider for this online learning system, sort of with McGraw-Hill, it's Learn Smart, which then sort of reduces everything to sort of key points. And here, each key point will be associated with a set of questions that you have at the end that will have yes or no answers. And sort of here, we can't expect students to read the whole book because that's not focusing on teaching efficient stuff. So what we have them do is the Learn Smart system sort of highlights those portions of the text that will actually show up on the exam. So the students don't have to read the other part. And sort of that becomes then the sort of a learning structure. I fought against it. I tried to sort of create an alternative that has here, it's, a key point that goes throughout. Theory does not answer questions. Empirical work does not answer policy questions. And I will ask that continually and have that as one sort of central key point through the whole book. But if you look, there's very little desire on the most part for people to care about it. In the US, half the people don't even care whether the students have read the book they've assigned or not. Half of them. Sort of they assign it, but you can just look and find anything else. If that, you're not interested in sort of, does this book have a different way of presenting models? So my structure is, here, I want students to learn the models, but learn them as models. But then recognize that here, the application of the models can be lots of different ways. And so the way you treat it, and that becomes very important as being part of it that the publishers don't want or see because it doesn't fit their new institutional structure, and they're pushing against that.
Professor Colander, thank you so very much. Let me bring back Rob Johnson for some closing remarks. Thank you so very much for today.
Thank you.
Well, as we come to a conclusion here, I wanted to inject some thinking into the experience, but I wanted to frame it in the context, which I think is very important, and where David's a lighthouse or a North Star for all of us. We live in a time where discord, hostility, polarization are very damaging. Recently, I made a podcast that's not yet been released with the Nobel laureate Michael Spence. And he said to me as we were discussing it, that the concern he had now is we're not all viewing ends that we all agree to, but just differing about the means. And that the polarity and the hostility and the avoidance and the stiff arming, or whatever you want to call it, is not in the spirit of a collaborative, holistic humanity moving forward. And with so many critical issues on the horizon, this becomes even more important. I'm very inspired in exploring this polarity and these emotional dimensions by some of the recent work by a man named Ian McGilchrist, whose book, The Master and the Emissary, about right and left brain, or Antonio Damasio, his book, Descartes' Error, and some of the things that go on in the psychology of that person inside the utility function. C.G. Jung talking about shadows and denial, and that's not an optimizer that's in the model. And I think opening ourselves to, which you might call the challenge of an exploration and a reunification of a sense of purpose that we all have to abide by is very important. Marvin Gaye, in the third verse of his song, What's Going On? He says, Mother, Mother, everybody thinks we're wrong, but who are they to judge us just because our hair is long? We've got to find a way to bring some understanding here today. Well, as you know, at the outset, we played a song from Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and it begins by declaring what the young people need, and that's the purpose of this event. You who are on the road must have a code that you can live by, and so become yourself, because the past is just a goodbye. Then there's discussion, and it moves to the addressing the children. And you of tender years can't know the fears that your elders grew by. And so please help them with your youth. They seek some truth before they can die. I can speak for the Young Scholars Initiative, but as an architect with Jay and Heske and Goncalo, there's a very important pathway here that matters to elders like David Colander and myself. We want to see you making progress and evolving and healing. That's part of our purpose at this time. And many of these discussions about the institutions and the kind of courage that David has demonstrated is towards that purpose. But we also, as we grow older, want to see you rise to the challenge. And with so many difficult issues related to things that the economics profession will, be forced to grapple with, that emotional healing, that exploration of the nature of how we reach agreement. David is an extraordinary example who's someone, I don't know if it's conscious, intuitive, it's some of both, I'm sure, brings us to a more constructive path. But there's still a long way on that road. And we're looking for all of you young aspiring professionals who take your time and attend here sessions like this. We're looking for you to be that North Star so we can grin as we pass the baton. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's always great to measure sobriety and inspiration, and knowing that to make a change, one has to be the change, but also not be unrealistic of what one can achieve, and try to work within the system to actually change the system in certain ways. There's balance, but you should not maybe let the balance, or maybe not let that daunt you and stop you from going too much in a conformist direction. If you can make the changes that you'd like to see in your research, in your teaching. So thank you very much, Bob. Thanks very much, Dave, and hopefully we'll be here for the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.